Should BP file for bankruptcy? We're going to weigh the pros and cons with bankruptcy and restructuring expert Peter Kaufman. All right, well, it has been more than 2 months since oil began leaking into the Gulf, and it could be more months until the leak is fully closed off with those relief wells. But in the meantime, the financial crisis BP is facing continues to grow. Is BP headed for bankruptcy? Should it be? Peter Kaufman is president and head of restructuring and distressed M&A at Gordian Group. Peter, welcome. A lot of talk about the financial options the BP faces. Should bankruptcy be on the table for them?
Well, I think it has to be. If they're looking out for the interests of their shareholders, they must be thinking about how do we deal with the unlimited liability civilly we're facing, criminal investigations, et cetera. And so they have to be thinking about what their options are, which certainly should include potentially filing their BP North American subsidiary to try and ring-fence liabilities away from the rest of their assets, potentially an insolvency filed in England. And can you imagine how the United States and the legitimate Gulf claimants are going to fare over with some home cooking in England? And so I think that they should be considering it. And conversely, I think this country, our government and the Gulf claimants need to be anticipating that and figuring out their own strategies.
Because, Ken Feinberg, who is now running the BP Compensation Fund, has said that basically a BP bankruptcy would be terrible for the people in the Gulf. Would it be?
It'd be a horror show. And here's why. Because even if it eventually worked out well, BP, unlike, for example, General Motors and Chrysler, who had no cash, no options, and were just an American corporation, BP has a lot of cash, and they have options. So they could delay, they could do an awful lot of things in a bankruptcy court in addition to try and ring-fence the liabilities. And I think what would happen is that our government, the taxpayers again, would be faced with having to come up with money to bridge to the Gulf claimants and turn around and then go after BP for their recovery. And that could be a very difficult process. I agree with Ken Feinberg. The reason I think he called it a horror is because it really would be, and I think that in turn is tremendous leverage for BP that we need to take into account in order to try and come up with an appropriate solution here. And at Gordian, when we advise either governments or boards of directors, we're looking for an overall elegant solution. Right now, there is no elegant solution.
No.
There's no overall solution.
No.
There's a promise to pay into a $20 billion fund, which is probably going to be a drop in the bucket. It's an unenforceable promise. And I think all sides need to be analyzing what everybody else can do so that people can come to the table and try and fix everything at once, as opposed to expecting that BP will continue to pay an unlimited amount or more and still face criminal liability.
I know you've worked with some of the auto companies, you've advised them. Do you think there's an internal battle at BP? On one hand, what they would want to do from a pure business perspective and what they need to do from a humanitarian perspective can be very different things.
Extremely different. And I'm sure that there's a debate going on in BP. I'm not addressing the humanitarian side. I'm simply looking at this from the cold perspective of looking out for BP shareholders and from a financial perspective for BP. Once you overlay what they may wish to do on a humanitarian basis, that will inform their strategies as well.
What would you advise them to do?
Well, they wouldn't be asking for my advice about humanitarian things. If they were asking my advice about how to
Should they spin off the U.S.? I know you kind of mentioned that there's been some talk. Maybe BP officially breaks off North American operations, the global company stays put, and the U.S. ops files.
Yeah, and before you can make that recommendation, you need to know a few things that are awfully complicated. What's the assets and liabilities at the various structure levels? What can you ring fence? What do you think the ultimate costs of cleanup and liability is going to be? What do you think the recoveries and outcomes, you gameplay that in bankruptcy and other scenarios. And when you have all that in the hopper, and by the way, it's the same analysis that we, as America and the Gulf claimants, ought to be doing as well, then you can come to some judgment about the risk-reward of filing or not filing. So if you think that the value of BP North America is $100 billion, but you think the cleanup costs and other liabilities are going to be $175 billion, that's a pretty powerful argument for trying to ring-fence, cut loose BP North America. If you have other different views, that'll change that calculation.
Peter Kaufman of the Gordian Group. Peter, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Trying to find some answers in a tough situation.